Hi, everybody. This is Joanne with Read Science, and I'm here with my co-host, Jeff Shaumeyer. And for a third time, we are welcoming Mario Livio, and for your seventh book, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So, and the book today on my phone is Galileo and the Science Deniers. So, and we're going to let Jeff do the official introduction.
Yeah, you're giving everything away, Joanne.
Oh,
so
you have more to say.
Yes, our very special guest on this episode is Mario Livio. Mario is an astrophysicist. He worked in that capacity until 2015 with the Hubble Space Telescope. I learned just this morning that Mario was born in Romania with what would sound like a long time ago, but probably doesn't seem much like a long time ago. I also read that he is, quote, the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra's official science advisor, which I thought sounded like a pretty sweet gig, really, that I'd enjoy. He also writes popular science books, at least 7 of them so far. I realized I became acquainted with Mario when I read his book, The Golden Ratio, about 15 years ago. It took us a while to talk together. We know him here at Read Science because we've previously talked twice about his books, Brilliant Blunders and Why, What Makes Us Curious. The first time we talked was only our 4th episode, way back in 2013. He's back with us for his unprecedented 3rd visit to talk about his new book, Galileo and the Science Deniers. We'll be sending you your frequent interlocutor card later. Well, welcome back, Mario. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. My pleasure to be here again.
Joanne.
Yeah, I suppose I should have a first question. I have many questions. So interesting. As you mentioned in the book, lots of books have been written about Galileo.
True.
So let's start with the obvious question. Why did you want to write a book about Galileo?
Right. It's a good question. And in fact, one that I thought about myself.
Yeah.
Well, clearly I've always been fascinated by Galileo. I'm an astrophysicist. I worked as an astrophysicist much of my life. He's definitely the founder of modern astronomy and astrophysics. So there is a connection there. I also realized that most, if not all, the book written about Galileo, biographies in particular, were written mostly by science historians.
Mm-hmm.
And not by sort of active research astronomers or astrophysicists. So I thought that, I can perhaps provide something new there in terms of, putting his science in the context of what we know today and how those things develop. So that was one motivation. A second motivation had to do with the fact that many of those superb biographies of him, because they have been written by science historians, they have been written as scholarly books, which are extremely interesting for somebody like myself. But the average, even educated reader, there are too many details there, and they are not that accessible. And I decided to write an accurate yet not too detailed or too long book about him. So this was the second reason. And the third reason, which only became more and more relevant as I was working, and in fact, after I finished the book, was the business of science denial, with which we have to fight still today, but against which he fought, 400 years ago, and is perhaps even best known for that. Mm-hmm. So I thought that the book would be very relevant for today, and it only has become more so even after I finished the book.
Well, it's interesting you said the word fought, because I think of this when I was a kid and we're in school and they were like, Galileo fought the church. But reading your book, I wasn't exactly convinced that he fought the church.
You're right. He didn't fight the church. His fight is very often being portrayed as if it was a clash between science and religion.
Mhm.
and it wasn't, and he never saw it as such. He
Right.
was a religious person. I mean, all people at his time were religious people. You know, he was a Catholic like everybody else. Uh, his fight was a fight between science and literal interpretations of scripture,
Mhm.
which he thought was the wrong thing to do. And his fight was as much to defend scripture, you know, as anything else, because he didn't want the Catholic Church to make the mistake of too literally interpreting the text when he argued that the Bible was never thought to be a science book
Mhm.
and therefore should not be taken as such. So yeah, so he didn't fight the church in that sense. He fought uh, for intellectual freedom, if you like.
There was a very interesting. It came up again in the late 19th century when after Darwin had published uh,
The origin of species.
yeah, the species origin of species, and there was some perceived conflict that I think was more than he thought. But wasn't it Leo XIII who wrote his famous statement that truth cannot contradict truth? And so there has to be a way to resolve these two things we take to be true. And that seemed very much almost in the foreground when you were talking about the conversations between Galileo and his inquisitors, that they recognized that these things could be both true, and they had to resolve the conflict somehow.
Right. Well, Galileo himself said scripture can never err. He said that. So basically, he said, so if there is an apparent conflict,
Mhm.
it means that we have just didn't understand exactly, you know, because he argued, look, the Bible was written for the common people to understand it, and it was written for our salvation and not, you know, to teach us science. He pointed out, look, even the planets are not named there.
It's true.
I think there was, trying to remember my thought, I think there was one more reason that I thought you wrote this book, and one thing that I liked about it very much is that when you write your books, you write the scholarly, the historical, the scientific, but you also tell us what you're thinking sometimes.
Yes,
And so I feel, you know, and it's not that it's entirely personal and it's all about you, but you're there always talking with us about these things. And I valued the fact that you presented these ideas, you looked at these conflicts, you discussed them, and then you told us what you thought about them too, so that we knew what you were thinking, which I found a very interesting and a valuable contribution. Do you think I'm wrong?
No.
You notice that, don't you?
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, very often in the book, I say, you know, some historians say that this and this, but you know, I think that that and that,
Yeah.
of that nature. Yes, yes, yeah. You know, you don't have to. I mean, you know, those people are like I say, scholarly and very knowledgeable, but you know, much of that is at the end also personal opinions of what people thought, and you know, I am entitled to my opinion as much as anybody else. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And that I made a note when I'd finished reading the book, and one of the questions that almost always seems to come up in a discussion like this that we usually avoid asking is, "Gosh, why did you write this book, and why do you write books?" And my feeling after reading this one was that you write books because you think about these things, you have ideas about them, and you feel like these ideas are worth sharing, so you tell us about them.
That is absolutely true.
So, and I liked that. I rejoiced in that. I thought it was very nice because, you know, we're scientists. We've been taught so often, or told so often, not to inject our personality or use the first person pronoun in anything that we write scientifically. And so it's rather nice to have good science, good history, where you feel at least like you can tell us what you're thinking too, because those thoughts are also interesting because you've got thoughts worth sharing.
Well, I'd actually like to talk about science denial, because when you were, or when Galileo was dealing with science denial. Well, science wasn't called science at that time, and it wasn't really what we think of it today. And so it's very interesting. So to sort of reframe it, looking at the way science is today and the way science deniers work today. So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about that for our audience.
So indeed, there were science deniers then, and there are science deniers now, but their motivations are definitely not the same. At least not only, there are different types of motivations. In Galileo's time, as I pointed out, I mean, the deniers mostly, it had to do with literal interpretations of scripture and with opinions that were forged during, hundreds and thousands of years since, Aristotle and Ptolemy. So basically, what happened is that in this particular case, the geocentric system in which all the planets and the sun revolved around the Earth, were in that model of Ptolemy and Aristotle. And that model has been adopted by the Catholic Church as its orthodoxy, because it fit in many ways. I mean, it's not, many hundreds of years later, they were not so concerned with whether or not this fits the observations exactly or not, but this fit with the general concept that humans were at the center of creation, and therefore clearly Earth had to be at the center of, the world, as they would, because that was the whole world that they knew at the time. Now, when you look at, and Galileo came and said, no, wait a second, maybe it looks like that, but it's not quite like that, and don't take what is written in the Bible literally. And he made this point based on a number of things, like I mentioned that the Bible was not written as a science book. The way to find facts is by experiments, observations, and reasoning. And he has this famous phrase which say that he did not believe that the same God that has given us our senses and reason and intelligence wanted us to abandon their use. So, so he said we should really look ourselves and see, and see what the observations and the experiments are telling us. Now, when I look at science denial today, this type of religiosity is very often not the motive for this, even though sometimes it is. I mean, there still are creationists that want to teach, side by side in science classes, creationist theories. They are now sometimes called by more fanciful names like intelligent design. But it's really the same thing. Side by side with Darwinian evolution. I mean, you mentioned Darwin before. So that thing still exists, literal interpretation of the Bible. There was, by the way, I mentioned this, there was a Gallup poll that found that 30-some% of Americans still think that humans were formed in their current state less than 10,000 years ago.
Yes.
So clearly those do derive from certain religiosity. But when you talk about things such as climate change, let's say, where, it's one of the more rampant science denial that we are encountering today, the motives there they don't come from religion. It's usually some form of political conservatism. Sometimes they involve in that what they think are economical reasons and things of that nature. So the motivation may be different, but the effect at the end is somewhat similar. Yes, I mean, in the case of COVID-19, for example, the initial response to COVID-19 was basically to ignore the science, right? Phrases such as
just a flu.
We now have 15 cases and soon it's going to be 0. Phrases said at the highest places in the land. Yes, I'm saying this with no political motivation. Yes, I'm just stating the fact. Yes, that this was said, and the reasons there had to do with political reasons. We are in a year of elections, all kinds of things of that nature. So it's not religiosity, but the effect is the same. You ignore the sign.
Well, this was a useful discussion too, because we all know stories about people who would come to see Galileo and he wanted to demonstrate perhaps, and they refused to look through his telescope. And I think we tend to look at that with 21st century eyes now and think of it as a sort of plausible deniability. But your discussion was much more interesting in the context. It's like the reason some people would not look through the telescope had nothing to do with not looking, but more to do with fearing that they might be tricked, and various reactions that are not the way we would think about that these days. It casts a different light.
Right. I mean, you see, Galileo introduced here something that did not exist until then, in the sense that you could only find evidence directly through your senses, was the feeling until then. And now he introduced a device, which, by the way, I should mention, he did not invent the telescope. He just perfected it and constructed his own telescopes, but the telescope was invented in the Netherlands. He suddenly introduced this new device and claimed that what he sees through it is real and represents a reality. And, people at some level, maybe even justifiably in the very early stages, said, but how do I know that what you see there is not some artifact of this device, of this magic that you are bringing here, and so on. And it was only after, people like the Jesuit astronomers from the Collegio Romano in Rome confirmed his observations that, people started to say, okay, now we have to understand what we're seeing, but certainly what we see is there. So that took a while to actually convince people of that.
And that was exceedingly novel because, like you said, this is the first time ever that someone came along and said, with this device, I see something that's real, but you can't see it unless you use this device.
Right. So it's sort of something that enhances your senses.
Yes, and that sounds suspicious, surely, the first time it happens.
Right.
And there are lots of firsts for Galileo, right? That you mentioned. I made the short list of things that he revolutionized, that you said: astronomy and astrophysics, laws of motion and mechanics, relation between man and reality, and experimental science. Not bad for one person.
And I would add to that the introduction of mathematics as the language of the universe.
Yes.
Right.
Which is, I don't know, barely recognizable perhaps if we look at it from this viewpoint, but he did do it, and he was quantifying it, and the whole idea of how, maybe we should talk a bit about how he almost certainly did not drop those things off the Leaning Tower.
I was going to say, why don't we talk about that?
But there is a great lesson behind that of how he discovered how he could do diluting gravity.
Right.
Is not an obvious thing to do. That was a major shift in order to discover the things that lie behind that story of the Pisa Tower.
Yeah. Actually, there are a few things about Galileo. You see, he has many discoveries, and many of them, he did with a telescope. So his greatness was more in understanding what he saw, and deriving, numerical facts from that. But there are some things where, to be honest, I just cannot imagine how he thought of that. Yeah. And one of them is this thing about, you see, he wanted to study free fall. Right. To study free fall, you have to drop objects to see them fall. Okay. And he had this intuition somehow, which you cannot understand how he had that if not for the air resistance, bodies of different weight would fall at the same rate and, would reach the ground together. But he couldn't experiment to actually show that. He had an intuition that that's how it should be. Now, to actually drop bodies and measure the time that they fall was very difficult at his time.
Back
There were
then,
no
yeah.
good time measuring devices at the time.
Yeah.
So he had this incredible idea that to use inclined planes and drop, bodies down inclined planes, because he said, look, free fall is an extreme case of an inclined plane when I put the inclined plane vertical to the ground, but I can put it at a very, very small angle to the ground, and then it would fall much more slowly. It would roll much more slowly, and that allows me to measure time more accurately. So this was an incredible idea on his part.
Now I read that now and I think, well, how did he just overlook that thing that's like when it's doing this, it's rolling down and not falling? But hey, it works. I've done it in the lab. We can just look past that.
Yeah, and and in principle, you can also, if you make an inclined, very, very shiny kind of, you actually think slide down,
Yes. That's my introductory physics teacher always said that we would buy those demonstration tools from the Ideal Pulley Company, where things have no mass and no friction.
But let me say something which is actually for students who study physics in high school.
Okay. Yeah.
You see, I don't know if that is still done today, but when I was in high school, we did problems of inclined planes to death.
Yes.
And we solved problems with inclined planes. And even then, as a student, I thought, but what? I mean, how come that I do so much with inclined planes, where, in everyday life, I don't encounter so many. Sure, yeah, I can run uphill or drive a car downhill, things, but not so many problems, on inclined planes. But once, you read about Galileo, you suddenly understand what a revolution in thinking this inclined plane represented. And you suddenly understand how, this led to such discoveries. Even, he's finding the trajectory of projectiles.
Yes.
Done using also an inclined plane. Basically, he rolled an object down an inclined plane onto an horizontal table, and then shot into the air. Right. And he then looked at, the trajectory of that object once it's in the air. And he was the first to discover that the trajectory of projectiles is a parabola. It's a mathematical shape that was known since antiquity.
Right.
Well, and so now this is the opening for me to recall that I wanted to start by showing a painting by Artemisia Gentileschi from 1620, I think was the right date, of Judith slaying Holofernes, the second version she did of that, which appeared in your book. And I was going to ask you what it had to do with Galileo. And the connection is the cultural significance of this discovery. So I'm going to ask you to describe that anyway. People can look up the painting and see what we're talking about.
Yes. Let me, if you allow me, I will preface that with a small introduction, which is Galileo was a Renaissance person. Well, first of all, he lived during late Renaissance.
Yes.
So clearly he was. But he was a Renaissance person in many other ways too. In the sense that, for example, he knew poetry very well. He gave 2 lectures about Dante's Inferno when he was 24.
Yeah.
He loved this poet Ariosto, and he wrote a whole essay comparing him to Tasso, another poet. He could recite entire pieces from these things. And he also studied drawing himself. He was a very accomplished draftsman. He was a musician. He played the lute, together with his father, who was a musician. Now, he had painter friends. For example, Cigoli was a famous painter, was a personal friend of Galileo. And Artemisia Gentileschi, who was she's very, very remarkable because, you know, in the Renaissance, we mostly talk about men painters.
Right.
And because, you know, women were not given the opportunity to paint much. Artemisia is an incredible painter. I even hate to call her a woman painter because she is simply one of the greatest painters of Renaissance Italy. You know, by himself, be it man or woman. Great, great painter. And she indeed painted a famous painting, which was Judith beheading Holofernes. And she did one version of that, and then she did a second one. And she was a friend of Galileo and corresponded with him on several occasions. And story has it, you know, we don't have this as documented evidence, but that Galileo informed her about the projectiles, you know, the trajectory of projectiles, that this is a parabola. And so in her second version, she painted the blood squirting out of Holofernes' neck, shooting up as a parabola, the blood shooting like this. So, you know, clearly she had from him, heard from Galileo what was the trajectory of that thing. On another occasion, by the way, she complained to him that a certain duke that bought a painting from her apparently didn't appreciate the painting because he paid her too little.
Well, that's a shame. There was one more cultural artifact that I enjoyed, but
I should say a certain marquis, not to do with
okay.
marquis. Yeah.
What I was annoyed at is that I have been more than once in the Pauline Chapel at Santa Maria Maggiore, and I stupidly did not look closely enough at the portrayal of Mary in the dome that you described, and now I'll look when I go back, but it irritates me. But this is another example of Galileo's influence on culture, right? That there's the famous depiction of, there we go, of Mary, Queen of Heaven. This is a common portrayal. Move it up just a little bit. Yeah.
She's standing on the moon.
That's right. And that the moon she's standing on in this particular painting is taken from Galileo's observations.
The moon of Galileo. You see, until that time, usually people painted the moon as a sort of pristine because there was this distinction between terrestrial things, which were corrupt and could die and this and that, and celestial or heavenly things, which had to be pristine and, you know, perfect, no blemishes and not so. And then, you know, one of Galileo's observations, of course, showed that the moon had all kinds of features, and in fact, he correctly interpreted them by understanding light and shadow, that he was seeing mountains and craters and things, that the surface was rugged. And that's how he drew it. You know, he had these fantastic, you know, drawings, these wash drawings of this.